I think it's fair to say that the majority of YouTube channels that talk about post-processing and manipulating images pretty much stick to Lightroom rather than Photoshop, unless they are speciality sites talking about Photoshop techniques. And particularly in the area of landscape photography, there seems to be an implicit assumption that people are producing YouTube content that their audience are going to exclusively use Lightroom. Now, back in the days before Adobe adopted a subscription plan, it's pretty obvious why. You could buy Lightroom for something around about $150, and to buy a full version of Photoshop would cost you around £600. So the pricing pretty much precluded a lot of people from using Photoshop. But with the latest subscription plans, and at the moment the Black Friday deal at $8.32, I believe it is, a month for Lightroom and Photoshop, you are pretty much getting Photoshop for free. Because if you think of the annual cost compared with the cost of updating Lightroom annually in the days before a subscription, you're probably talking about the same price. And yet still a lot of people will not use Photoshop or do not use Photoshop. And I think part of the reason for that is that there is a perception that it's highly complicated, more difficult to use than Lightroom, and actually slower to get to a final outcome. And Adobe Photoshop has been described as the 850 kilogram gorilla. It allows you to do everything, but it's immensely daunting. So what I want to do here is just to very briefly just pick up a few things that you try to do in Lightroom using things like graduated filters and using radial filters and using range masks, and show actually how easy it is to do it in Photoshop, and how in fact it offers you far more control with very much little additional effort. So what I've got here is an image, and I'm going to play around with it a little bit here just to show some examples of the sorts of things that you might want to do. First thing I'm going to do is just a little bit of local luminosity adjustment. So this would be akin to dodging and burning. So I'm going to darken down this area of shadow here just to increase the impression of depth. The next thing I'm going to do is slightly enhance the saturation of these four leaves here and just brighten them up a bit. And the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to darken down the sky, and I'm going to accentuate the blue color. Now, all of these things you could do with Lightroom, but if you've got a shape like this, you get into using brushes or radial filters, it's very difficult to match the exact size, and so you end up doing a little bit of fiddling around. The other thing is, if you was to start to use 2 or 3 radial filters and then perhaps a graduated filter for the sky, you start to lose track of what you're doing. You have these various things scattered about your image like confetti, and it's difficult to keep track of it. Now, the key thing or key difference for Photoshop to Lightroom, once you've done your conversion, is that Photoshop offers you the option of using layers. And all I'm going to do here is just use adjustment layers. Now, you've got the adjustment layers up here, but I'm going to use the menu down here because you start using these and sometimes these icons disappear. So if you click this half semicircle icon here, it gives you a list of the various adjustment layers that you can create. And the first one that I'm going to do is I am going to set up a curves layer. So I've got the curves layer here now, and it's got a mask on there, but the mask is completely clear, showing that whatever I do with this image will be applied, whatever I do with this layer will be applied to the whole image. I don't want that. What I want to do here is just reset that. I want to apply this just to darken down this area here. So what I'm going to do now is use one of the facilities that Photoshop gives you to create masks yourself. And that's all Lightroom is doing, is creating masks. But what happens is it's basically hidden from you. But let's say I select color range here. And what I'm going to do with color range, I can select sample colors. and I've got three icons here. Dropper to select the color, and then I can add the color, and I can subtract for the color if I get too wide a range. So let's just click on the area that I want to get. Now, the other thing that I've got here is I've got a range. This can narrow in to the point where I actually clicked on the image, but I want it to apply across the full width, so we'll leave that. And then we've got this fuzziness, which is basically the depth. And you see I can slide this, it will affect more or less of the image. So I can just narrow this down until it's just covering the area that I'm interested in darkening. So I've created a mask very quickly just for the area I want. And I click OK, and that mask is now applied. And now what will happen is if I pull down the curve or push up the curve, I only affect the item, the area that I've selected. So what we've got here is I've just darkened down that area. Now with a mask I could paint it in, I could do it by hand, but it's very much quicker just to use the color range. If I wanted to adjust that slightly by hand, if I hold down the Alt key and click on the mask, you can see I've got a little bit of color bleed here that I maybe don't want. So with this mask, anything that's white will be revealed, anything that's black will be concealed. So I can paint on this now as though it's an image. So I select the paintbrush and I select my foreground color, which I want to be black. And if I just paint on here, and what I've got here is I've got the opacity and the flow fairly high because I just want to paint this in as black. I don't want to mess around with grey. So I've just tidied that mask up just a little. And let's go back to the pointer and then go back to my layer. And that's just tidied it up just to make sure that mask only applies where I want. So that's the first thing I wanted to do. Second thing I want to do is just to brighten up and perhaps increase the saturation of these orange areas here. So I'm going to create another layer, another adjustment layer, and I'm going to pick hue saturation. And again, I've got my mask, and what I want to do now is select the color range for these orange tones. So I go to select color range again and just pick up. Right, just pick one that gives me a reasonable starting point. And again, I can adjust my fuzziness to get what I want. I can perhaps use a plus here this time to see if I can pull in a bit more over there, and I don't really want this area down here, so I could use a minus and just take out this. And so there we go. I've taken out something in the trees there by removing that, so I'm going to just put that back in again then. That's a bit better. So now you can see that the mask, the area that's going to be revealed by the changes, now matches the trees. I've not had to draw that in, I have not had to go around anything, it's just selected the colour range I want to use. So I click OK now. Now what you will see with the hue, saturation and lightness, I don't want to change the hue, but if I push the saturation up, you can see I can saturate that, just that area, and I can make it brighter or dim it down to see how I want the image to look. Now, if I just take this icon here and click it on and off, you can see what I've done, and it's just affected the trees. And perhaps that's a little bit too bright. Now I could go back and change these, but the other thing I can do with a layer is I can change the opacity of the layer. So I can just dial that down. If I take it back to 0, it has no effect at all, and I just bring it up slowly. Speed which bring it up really depends on how fast your computer is, otherwise you'll get a bit of a lag. So I think that's about right, maybe 54%. So now I've used a layer to darken a little bit of the foreground area. I've used another layer to enhance the saturation and the luminosity of the autumn leaves, and the final thing I want to do is just to darken down the sky a little bit. Probably doesn't need it in this image, but for illustration purposes let's do that. So I want to select the sky. Again, all I'm doing in this series of exercises creating masks analogous to a gradient density filter. Now, if I was to use a gradient density filter in Lightroom, what I'm going to end up doing is overrunning the trees here, and then I'd have to use a brush to try and clear that up, and then I'd have problems where there was areas of sky between the twigs. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another adjustment layer, and I'm going to again go to hue saturation. I could apply different adjustment layers, but we'll stick with this. And what I want to do is select the sky. And again, what I'm going to do is select the color range, because for this application, I think it will be the most versatile. Now, the color range sampled colors are as I set it for my previous layer. So I'm going to just reset those. And now you can see I've picked up some of the sky. It's not picked up the clouds, so we can pick up the clouds as well. We can look, maybe there's a bit more there and maybe a bit there, and I can look at that, and that looks pretty good. If I click OK, now it's created, you can see it's created a mask that's just selected the sky. Again, if I hold Alt and click that, it shows me the mask, and what you can see is the advantage of this is that it has actually shown the areas of the sky amongst the branches, and this is something that's really incredibly difficult to do with Lightroom. There's a little bit of bleed through here, don't particularly want that, so again I can select the brush, select the foreground colour to black, and then just brush that out. Okay, go back to the bigger and go back to my hue saturation. And now let's just take the lightness down or up. So if I take it down, I brighten it up, and then I can just darken it down a bit. And there we go. So I've darkened the sky, a bit of a moody sky there. And if I want to, I can play around with the hue on that, and I can play around with the saturation. Now that's overdone. And again, if I want to make some fine adjustments, I can just dial that down in the luminosity until I get to a level I want. Now, a couple of other points. As I showed before, if you wanted to see what various things have done, you can turn these layers off. So you can see your original image, and you can put them back on to see what's happened. Now, if you wanted to make a lot of more detailed adjustments to keep track of these, you could actually label them. So we could double click on that. We could call that dodge, because we've been dodging and burning. Help if I didn't have a typo. And this one, I've adjusted the leaves, so we could call this leaves. And on this one, I can call that sky. So now I've not just got this confetti of different radial and gradient filters. I have got discrete layers with discrete names, and you can lock these together and do all sorts of fancy things, which I tend not to do. But in terms of simple adjustments, I find this is far faster than using Lightroom. And the reason that I'm doing this video is it took me a good few years before I actually realized just how much simpler it was to use Photoshop than to use Lightroom once you get beyond a fairly simple set of adjustments. Now, the final thing here is when you've finished, if you save this file, it will save it as a TIFF with multiple layers, which will be larger. If you want to save it, if you've finished your adjustments and you're sure you're not going to go back to them, if you go to the layer manual, flatten image, it will compress all of those and lock in those changes, and then when you save your image, it will save it in whatever file name or format you want with your adjustments baked in. So I hope you find this useful, and I hope I've convinced you that if nothing else, it's worth having a go with Photoshop. If you've got the photographer's subscription package, you're getting it anyway, so why not have a try and use it? Good luck and goodbye.